Today, you're going to learn exactly how to decide how much to charge as a composer. This is advice I've gleaned from conversations with working composers and from my own experience in the film music industry. I'll uncover 3 methods of deciding your rate and the key things you need to take into account when deciding how much to charge. Let me start by saying the same thing I say in almost every single video. Building strong relationships is one of the most important, if not the most important part of becoming a film composer. But good relationships have to work both ways. I've spoken a lot about the importance of giving and not being a taker, but that doesn't mean that you should be taken advantage of. Good relationships are built on trust, respect, and clear expectations. If you build relationships with those 3 things in place, you'll find that the question of what to charge becomes null and void, as the filmmakers you're working with will have you in mind right from the start of their projects, so will already have set aside a budget for you, which they'll be honest and upfront about. The filmmakers that I've had the best relationships with often begin talks with me by saying how they have a new project in the pipeline and the budget for music is X. That makes life so much easier. Of course, that's the ideal scenario, but we all know the world doesn't always work in ideals. Now, before we dive into the key things to consider when setting your rate, there's one more important thing to think about: your perceived value. Without going too far down the sales psychology rabbit hole, all products or services have a cost and a value. Take Starbucks as an example. A cup of coffee might cost less than 50p for them to make, but they sell them for 4 or 5 times that. How can they do that? Because of the perceived value, the value of that cup of coffee and the experience of going to Starbucks. What am I getting at here? How does this relate to you as a film composer? Well, if you're always focused on your cost, like your hourly rate, then you're not focusing on your value. And if you can make the experience of working with you truly valuable, then you can increase that value exponentially. And yes, it takes time and experience to build a reputation, but that doesn't mean that you can't start focusing on increasing your perceived value right now. By making sure you present yourself as a professional in all your communication and through your website, showreel, and whatever other marketing tools you can use, you can immediately make yourself appear more professional and therefore more valuable. I actually know people that have been recommended for projects based purely on how they were perceived. The person recommending them had never heard any of their music. They just assumed they could write great music based on how well they presented themselves. Okay, let's talk about how to actually decide what to charge and the things you need to consider when setting your rate or deciding on projects. First up, how to decide what to charge. Really, there are 3 methods. The single most common and most often recommended way to decide what to charge is to simply ask. Yep, that's right. When you're asked for your rate, throw the ball back into their court and ask what the budget is. There are a few more nuances to this, which I'll talk about in just a moment after we cover the other 2 options. Option 2 is similar, but can give you a slightly more defined starting point, which is to go with a percentage of the entire project budget. This used to be a more common method of arriving at the music budget, but for some reason is less popular nowadays. The numbers that get thrown around are between 5 and 10% of the overall budget. So if the project has a budget of $100,000, the music budget should have a budget between $5,000 and $10,000. Be warned though, I've heard those numbers disputed regularly, but they're at least a starting point for you to go off. And the final option is to set more exact rates for yourself. This could be as an hourly rate, as in how much you charge per hour of your time, or as a per minute of music rate. Obviously, there are calculations you'll need to make here to find a fair rate for yourself that is in line with industry averages. I found most people have an either love or hate relationship with this method. People who use it love it, people who don't hate it. The benefit is that you always have a starting point, and it removes any awkwardness or difficulty from budget questions. When someone asks you what you charge, you immediately have a number to go to. And when you think about it, it's a much more ordinary way of doing business. If you took your car to a mechanic, they'd quote you for the job based on the amount of time it takes them and the difficulty of the job. When you go to a hairdresser, it's the same thing. They charge for time plus complexity. The downside is that it can create some inflexibility and can reduce the relationship to a service-based relationship rather than a creative collaboration. As in, the filmmaker is now hiring you for a service and potentially making their hiring decision based on price rather than working with you to decide how to bring you on board and working together to figure out the budgetary requirements. I see it as another one of those ideal world things. In an ideal world, it would be lovely to have your rate and stick to it. But as we've already covered, the ideal world isn't always the real world. If you do decide to go this route, you'll need to do some careful thinking and analysis of your workflow to figure out how long things take you and what you want or need to earn per hour or per minute of music. Always take into account different levels of complexity. For example, how many instruments there are and how many individual cues there are. One 10-minute cue is usually less time-consuming than 5 2-minute cues, and writing for full orchestra will take a lot more time than writing for piano, generally speaking. So, create a little pricing chart for yourself with different levels of complexity and use that as your starting point. Again, to give you some ballpark figures, most people say $100 per minute of music should be an absolute minimum, going up to over $1,500 per minute of music for really high-end stuff. Okay, let's loop back to option 1, which is my personal favorite and one that I find recommended most often by composers asking for their budget. Why does this work so well? Well, to begin with, it can remove the risk of you either massively undervaluing yourself or scaring them off by massively overcharging. How annoying would it be to quote $5,000 for a project only to find out later that they could have afforded double that? Or quoting a rate and then being completely ghosted by the filmmaker. But secondly, and perhaps more importantly, it means that right from the budgeting stage, you can already begin to have creative conversations. You can discuss with the filmmakers the kinds of things they can afford with their budget, or the kind of things they could afford if they could stretch a little bit. Filmmakers are often fearful when it comes to music, as it's part of the process that they know can have such a huge impact on the movie, but they feel they don't have so much control over. They know the language when it comes to editing and cinematography, but are often lost with music. They're relying on you to support them and hold their hand through the process. If you can begin that hand-holding right at the budgeting stage, you're letting them know they've made the right choice. It basically allows you to work with their budget, whatever that budget is. But it does mean that you have to really know your costs so that you know exactly what you'll be able to do with whatever budget they throw at you. I'll talk a little more about costs later in this video. Of course, there's a chance that they won't actually know what their budget for music is. Particularly for less experienced filmmakers, detailed budgets that include separate budgets for each department aren't always planned at the outset. If that happens, then you have a couple of options. You can either refer to option 3, your exact rate, and you can give them some options, like if they wanted just a handful of instruments and 10 minutes of music, it would cost X. For a full orchestra, it would be Y, etc. Or you can suggest the 5 to 10% of the entire movie budget as in option 2. As I said, it's often, not always, but often, more inexperienced filmmakers that don't know their budgets, so they'll be thankful for the ballpark figure to get them started. With all of the options, there are a few things that you need to factor into decisions about your rate. First, the potential for back-end royalties. Without going into too much detail, when you compose music that will be synced to media, there's a few ways that you get paid. There's your actual fee. That's really what we've been talking about so far in this video, the amount that you'll charge to actually create the music. But then there are royalties, which come as mechanical and performance royalties. Mechanical royalties are paid when your music is recorded, manufactured, or distributed. That includes when it's streamed. And then performance royalties are due when your music is performed or broadcast. It sounds complicated, but as long as you get registered with a performing rights organization like PRS in the UK or BMI or ASCAP in the States, they handle all the collections on your behalf, thankfully. Why this is an important thing to think about when setting a rate is that it could transform a project from being financially unfeasible to actually being worthwhile. For example, a project might have a super low budget, a micro budget, but it could be almost guaranteed to have considerable airtime on a major television network, in which case you could get some really great back-end royalties. Definitely something worth thinking about, but not something that the filmmaker should pressure you with. Good royalty payouts are never guaranteed, so should be considered as your tip jar rather than part of your actual salary. That analogy probably works better in Europe than in the States, but you get the message. You should do everything within your power to maintain rights to your royalties and back-end payments. Another factor is the kind of license you'll be granting to the filmmakers and what kind of rights you'll retain for the music. There's a ton of different contract types out there. It's difficult to say what a standard film music contract includes, but often you'll grant the filmmaker the right to use your music exclusively for the film in perpetuity. That means for life. You also often allow them to use the music in any and all advertising for the movie. What's important to note is that you're not giving away your music entirely. You're licensing it to the filmmaker. That means you still retain the rights to the music, including the royalties that I mentioned before. Now, once again, why does this matter when it comes to your rate? Well, it's another thing that you can factor in. If the filmmaker wants the music exclusively for life, then you need to make sure your fee is fair, since you're essentially locking your music into that single project forever. But if the filmmaker is happy for you to license your music elsewhere too, or if they agree to the exclusivity lasting a set amount of time, say a year or two, then you have an opportunity to use the music you create elsewhere, perhaps by converting it into library music tracks or pitching it for other projects. So you could further monetize that work if the music is appropriate. Again, not something the filmmaker should hold over your head, but something that can help make micro budgets more worthwhile. Of course, there's the obvious consideration of the actual potential for the project too. As with royalties, if the project is almost guaranteed to go on to great things and is set up to be entered for awards and the likes, then what happens after the project can be actually taken into account as well. Is it likely to lead to bigger things? Will it introduce you to important industry contacts? Is there a chance of you getting any award nods? All things to factor into whether a project or budget is worthwhile. I promise I'll address the working for free question soon, but once again, it's important that you don't let filmmakers use the promise of exposure to lower your fee. Project potential is just another thing for you to consider in whether or not you take on a project. It works both ways too. If a project is a clear dead end, not going to go anywhere or have any kind of impact, then you'll want to make sure your fee reflects that and that you charge more. And finally, related to everything we've talked about so far, and something to consider in all three budgeting options, is to make sure you establish the terms straight away and in writing. When you buy something from a shop, you're entering into an agreement, and you and the shop both understand the terms and expectations. You expect to walk away with a working product, they expect to get paid the ticket price, and you both understand your right to a refund. You need to have those terms clearly agreed with your filmmaker too, not only from a legal or contractual perspective, but for the sake of your relationship. If you don't both set the terms clearly at the beginning, it can get really difficult and really awkward later on if there's a misunderstanding or problem. The last thing you want is a simple misunderstanding to completely ruin a good relationship. The more problems I've encountered in life, the more I've realized how many can be avoided through good communication and having clear expectations. Film scoring isn't any different. So, make sure you establish exactly what's expected, including rights and royalties, but also things like costs. If you need to record musicians, or if there's a specific sample library or piece of equipment that you'll need to purchase, will that come out of your fee or the project budget? Will you be responsible for all recording and mixing, or will that be handed off to someone else? If it's being handed off, will you maintain rights to the recording and the composition, or just the composition? How many revisions will be included at the agreed fee? What happens if you need more time and money? What are the deadlines? All of these things need to be agreed early on so that everyone knows exactly what the deal is. On most projects nowadays, the composer is on a package deal where they're responsible for all aspects of the music, so any recording or mixing costs come out of your fee. That said, there are all kinds of exceptions, so make sure you get that clarified. Okay, now the big question. Should you work for free? This question sparks all kinds of debate, and there are so many different opinions flying around. So bear that in mind when you hear my answer. I'm just another voice, another opinion. And my opinion is that yes, you'll probably need to work for free. Now that doesn't mean that you should advertise yourself for free work, but it does mean that you should work with and collaborate with people that are at or slightly above your level. And if you're just getting started, then that means you're at level 0, the bottom rung of the ladder. Your first few projects should be for experience and for you to really figure out your workflow. This comes with a huge caveat though. You should only work for free on projects where everyone is working for free, basically as a collaborator. You should not be taken advantage of. Working for free should be an enjoyable experience for you. Now, that doesn't mean that there'll be no creative disputes or no problems, but it does mean that you should feel respected for the work you're doing and that you're treated as an important part of the team. Because the whole point of working for free is to get experience and build relationships. If those relationships are meaningless, then your work is meaningless too. Another way of thinking about it is a balance of the 3 M's: music, money, and mates. I first came across this in a Facebook post by Steve Berry. Music is how musically rewarding a project is, money is how much you're going to get paid, and mates is how well you know the person hiring you and how close you are. Essentially, rate each area between 0 and 3, with 0 being the worst possible and 3 being the best, and then add up the total. If the total is below 3, don't do it. Between 3 and 6, do it, but try not to make a habit. If it's 6 and above, do it. I've given you a lot to think about in this video, but before we recap, I wanted to add one final point. Always keep your career trajectory in mind. Always aim to move onwards and upwards. Don't get stuck doing the same thing for the same money for the rest of your life. Try to keep raising your number in the 3 M's exercise. Keep climbing the ladder. I'm always telling composers to be giving, to be helpful, in order to be memorable. And I stand by that. But you need to know when you're giving too much, when you're being taken advantage of. If you don't treat yourself or act like a professional, no one else will treat you that way either. If you were an electrician, you'd start as an apprentice before moving up to a fully fledged electrician, before most likely setting up your own firm. Treat your composer career in the same way. Know when you've finished your apprenticeship. Know when it's time to move up. So, to recap everything we've covered, focus on building excellent working relationships so that talks about budgets become almost a non-issue. Treat yourself as and act like a professional to increase your perceived value. The 3 most accepted ways of setting a rate are: number 1, asking for their budget; number 2, taking a percentage of the entire project budget; and number 3, setting your hourly or per minute of music rate. For all those methods, remember to factor in the potential for royalties, the type of license agreement, and the potential of the actual project. Make sure terms and expectations are clearly set out in writing. Work for free, but only as a collaborator, and consider the 3 M's: music, money, and mates. And finally, make sure you're always moving onwards and upwards. Focus on your long-term career. I wish I could just say, as a beginner, charge this much, and as an intermediate, charge this much, and as a pro, charge this much, but sadly, it's not as easy as that. Yet another skill you need to master as a film composer is the art of negotiation and sales. But I hope this video has given you a starting point and that you're now confident about the key things you need to consider. If this video has helped you understand how to set your rate as a composer, then hit the subscribe button and notification bell. And if you want more film scoring and industry advice, head on over to soundtrack.academy and subscribe to my free newsletter. That's where I share my absolute best content. Finally, it's over to you. When it comes to setting your rate, which of the 3 options, asking their budget, a percentage of the project, or setting your own rate, would you be most confident using? And what other questions do you have about each option? Let me know in the comments.